My fellow sheep, election season is upon us. Are you one of the 12% of Americans who still approves of our government? Then we need your help to force the other 88% into compliance. Our democracy depends on it. We're an organization called Citizens Against Too Much Unfettered Freedom, or CATMUF. CATMUF is a bipartisan flock of sheep whose goal is expanding government until nothing else remains. Because the government is here to help you. How can you help CATMUF help you? By only voting for candidates dedicated to expanding government. It's easy. You don't need to study the issues. No matter what a politician says when running for office, they're all dedicated to expanding government. And make sure you tell all your friends and family to vote for more government. Here at CATMUF, we don't care if you vote Democrat or Republican, as long as you vote for candidates committed to growing our federal family. CATMUF, 'cause folks just aren't smart enough to handle real freedom.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Abolitionist Abstractions. As always, we are covered by a BIPCOT no government license. This allows reuse by anyone except governments and the agents thereof. You can find out more information about this at bipcot.org. So I am back. This is Jeremy, and it's just me again this week. And I actually had a topic that came up multiple times yesterday that I figured I would talk about. It's one that's been talked about quite a bit in our circles, but because of the nature of the conversation I had yesterday with a friend of mine and a Facebook post I saw from another friend of mine, I thought this was as good a time as any for me to talk about it. And the topic, of course, is the wonderful government drug war. And this came up for me first because I saw a post from a friend of mine, one of the few people that I would still call a friend here on Long Island in the horrible Democratic People's Republic of New Yorkistan that I am still stuck in. And she was very upset about the fact that apparently there has been some talk about opening up some safe places for drugs to be used. And this is an idea that has been tried out in different places across the country, other places across the world, where instead of punishing people for putting what they choose to put in their own body, they set up these safe areas where clean needles can be handed out and other paraphernalia, and people can have a safe place to do these drugs rather than hiding in corners and, in alleys and stuff like that and risking, dirty needles or whatever the drugs they're using. And my friend, she was very upset about this. And I can understand her being upset because she has lost multiple family members and friends to drug overdoses. So, the emotion, I totally get it, being frustrated that, oh my God, these people are just going to be freely doing these things all over the place. Now, I keep referring to my friend. I'm not going to mention her by name because I don't want to embarrass her in any way. And honestly, I was going to go to her with this conversation, but over the past couple of years, different times with things that have gone on with me, and she's one of the few people from my past who's actually shown interest in the philosophy that I now follow. And she was very helpful last year when things went horrible for me with everything that went down. She was actually the person who put Murder Dog and I up for a night when we had to clear out of the house when there was the threats that the FDNY was coming to my house to light it on fire. For those of you who haven't followed that story, check back to the litany of podcasts and videos I've put out regarding my situation. Anyway, so I didn't really want to embarrass her, and also because some of the conversations we've had, she's basically just said, oh, yes, that makes total sense, and then nothing has changed. So I really didn't want to get into it because I thought it might just be a waste of my breath, but I figured it was a perfect opportunity to use that as a show topic. And then also yesterday, shortly after I saw that post and started formulating this idea, I got into a text message conversation with my buddy Tyrone, who I've mentioned before. Hey, Ty, I know you're going to listen to this. What's up, bud? And it ended up, we were talking about a whole bunch of different things about, anarchy, the end of government, borders, and the drug war ended up coming up. And during that conversation with him, he was trying to ask me what I thought going forward would be, steps that could be taken to actually, lead to freedom, that type of conversation we've all had before. And the one thing I said to him when the drug war came up is, I said, the drug war, and ending the drug war, I hate that phrase, add war to anything, that's government for you. But ending the government drug war would change the landscape on so many levels that it might have the single greatest impact outside of possibly ending the Fed. And I said that to him, and then I quickly followed it up by saying, I say only possibly or maybe in regards to the Fed, because sure, if the Fed were to end, then government would turn around and just nationalize the money system again like it's done in the past, and they'd still have control, and that's not much better. So I'm all for ending the Fed, and I've been out there and the Fed rallies before and all these different things, and I'm all for it. But I think the drug war, because of the insidiousness of it, ending that would change things so dramatically that I think that might have the single greatest impact of anything that you could do to stop government in its tracks, or at least put a huge dent in what it's able, in the destructive force it's able to bring upon people's lives. So, with that being said, I wanted to get into the topic of this drug war. And like I said, it started with this post I saw from my friend, and I do understand her upsetment. And, having friends and family members lost to drug overdoses, it can't be easy. And I was with her through a couple of these, at least. I know at least one of her brothers and one of her friends she lost to. We were talking a lot through those times, and we were still really, really close. So I remember it all, and I remember how hurtful it was for her. But to lash out and think it's a bad idea to set up these, safe areas for drugs to be used based on this emotion from what happened to, friends and family members of yours, it's not really clear-headed thinking. Because in reality, they're setting up these safe spaces for people to use these drugs more safely. And I know that may shock some people, probably not most of my audience, but some people who may catch this, that may shock people. Yeah, government actually makes drugs more dangerous. There is plenty of statistical evidence, historical evidence to prove this time and time again. I mean, you can go back to the alcohol prohibition in the 20s and 30s. And the government was actually caught poisoning bathtub, people were creating like bathtub gin and stuff, proving for one of the millionth times that prohibition just doesn't work, because if you prohibit something, it's going to encourage more people to want to try it, and then people are going to try to find ways to get the things that they want regardless of what the government says. So people back then were creating things, the term was bathtub gin, and the government was actually caught poisoning these things to try to get people, to try to convince people that, all these horrible underground places that are providing this booze to you are dangerous and it's going to kill you. It was the government trying to kill you, not the people trying to create the booze in their bathtub. I mean, sure, in the beginning, occasionally somebody would screw up and you make a mixture and get some people sick, but it wasn't intentional, because just like any good free market entrepreneur, you want to provide a service to your customers so you can get compensated. Well, if you're killing off your customers, you're not going to get compensated for very fucking long. So the idea that, everyday people who try to provide these type of services would willingly, hurt their customers is ludicrous. Only a crazy person would do that, or a government official. But then I repeat myself. Anyway, so, the prohibition thing has been proven time and time it doesn't work, but that's what ended up happening during the alcohol prohibition. And now you look what happens during the drug prohibition, because, of course, famously, good old FDR first made gold illegal, And there was a point in time where there was 1 day or a 2 day period back in, was it 34, I guess, somewhere around there, when he switched it. And one day gold was illegal to have, but cannabis was perfectly legal to have. And then he signed some bills, and then flip flop. Oh my God! A couple days later, now it's illegal to have cannabis, but gold is perfectly fine again, and vice versa. Or sorry, it was the other way around. But yeah, it's so ridiculous. Like with a twitch of a pen, all of a sudden these things become illegal. But ever since then, people have been trying to figure out ways to get around the system, because that's what they will always do. You cannot prohibit things from people. Like I said before, prohibiting things just encourages more people to want to try them, or at least investigate them. Or people who are already doing it makes people want them more. It's part of our nature. It's just, just like telling a little kid, don't touch that. What's the first thing a kid's going to want to do? They're going to want to touch it. Curiosity. It happens. So, the prohibition in that sense is already starting off on a bad foot, and then people will go out of their way to try to find ways around this prohibition. And that's why now, today in 2018, you have this explosion of all the terms like designer drugs and all these different things that come out there, and people creating all these different concoctions, and the potency of these drugs skyrocketing through the roof. People becoming chemists in their basement to create all these things. This is what happens. This is not the natural progress of trying to prohibit people from getting these things, and trying to punish people, and then creating even stiffer punishments for the individuals who are caught with these things. Instead of deterring individuals, it makes people get more creative. And nowadays we have things like bath salts, and really hardcore meth, and all these things that most likely wouldn't even exist if not for the government prohibition on things like cannabis and cocaine and heroin and all these other things in the first place. Because if you take all these so-called drugs and make them illegal, and not to mention the three in particular that I just mentioned, cannabis, cocaine, and heroin, all three of which, if you go back in the records, were used by medical professionals. These were handed out by doctors, prescription. These were handed out as medications for different things for tens, 20, dozens, hundreds of years. These were used, cocaine, cannabis. These were all used. You can go back as early or as late as I think it's the early 1900s. You can find medical books where all these things are still talked about, and a list of possible symptoms that could be provided relief by these products. So these things have been around and in use for hundreds, thousands of years. People were using them and not becoming horribly addicted to them. And then government comes in and decides, no, we need to control all this stuff. And then, people get creative, and people start finding new ways to produce these products. And when those products become impossible to obtain, or the risk becomes too high, then they find other things to do. And that's why we have all these myriad of different drugs that have come out since then, is because people are just trying to find ways to get around the system. And that's what makes it more dangerous. And then, of course, when you have things like this being illegal, and it falls in the hands of people within the black and gray markets to try to provide these products to the people that want them, the risk runs up. So people are willing to take, some people are willing to take more chances. Some people are willing to take less chances. There's a lot of violence that's involved in it. Most of the gang war stuff that people want to talk about as a big problem, most of it has to do with the drug war. All the problems with the cartels all has to do with the drug war. So all of these things have not been fixed or even helped by government intervention. In fact, they have been exacerbated and made so much worse. So when I see people upset about the fact that, whether it's the talk of possibly legalizing different drugs, which that's a whole different discussion, legalization versus the decriminalization. I personally am for decriminalization, because legalization just leads to things like you see in Colorado and Washington State and all these places where, sure, they legalize cannabis, but then they charge an insane amount of tax upon it. To the point where I've read a lot of studies coming out of Colorado that a couple of years after the fact, the black and gray markets are still doing pretty well, despite the fact that recreational cannabis is legal in Colorado and people can go into all these stores and just purchase it the black and gray markets are still doing quite well. Why? Because people don't want to pay their insane amount of taxes on their damn smoke. So, but like I said, that's a conversation possibly for a different time. But as far as the just the drug war in general, as I've been saying, it's just the government intervention and all this stuff just leads to worse. So putting up a safe spot for people to do drugs is definitely, in my opinion, a step in the right direction. I know there has been talk, and I think they've been implementing these. We did a Freedom Fiend show about this a couple months ago, John Vibes and I think we were talking about, I believe they were already starting to implement these in Philadelphia, or if not, it was on the docket to be implemented. And, there's a lot of complaints coming up from there, too. People saying the same things. Oh, all these druggies are just going to be hanging out. And let's look at a real world, real life, real time example of what happens when you start treating people as individuals and being allowed to put what they want in their own body as long as they're not harming anybody, instead of treating people as criminals for doing those exact same actions. And the greatest example of this is, of course, Portugal. And the country of Portugal, the Portugal government, which, of course, I'm not a big fan of governments, but this was, talk about steps in the right direction. I think it was back in 2001. The government of Portugal decided to decriminalize pretty much all drugs, or at least most amounts of all drugs. I think there was still like really large amounts of certain drugs that if caught with, you could still be considered trying to distribute or something like that. But for the large part, they decriminalized most drugs back in 2001. So here we are now, 2018, and all the people, my friend included, who think things like this would just lead to everybody getting strung out and junkies all over the place and murder, rapes, and assaults and everything all the crime raising because all these horrible drug addicts are just roaming the streets. Yeah, that didn't quite happen. Because that's what most people expected. 17 years later, that's what people would expect in a place like Portugal when they do all this stuff. Not so much. Because if you look at the facts of what's happened, they actually have, one of the world's lowest addiction rates. People, all the different things, all the negative stuff related to drugs that people worry about. All of those figures have dropped over the last 17 years. Even things like HIV, like people contracting HIV from sharing needles and stuff like that. Everything across the board has just dropped. Why? Because you gave people the freedom to do what they want. And as has been suggested by other people, and I thought the same thing too, it was kind of proven out. Sure. In the beginning, there was an uptick in usage for certain drugs because they were trying to track, doing anonymous surveys and stuff like that for as accurate as they can be. But, just trying to get a feel for how many people, looking at the hospitals and how many people were getting admitted for overdoses and all these things. And for the first year or so, there was definitely an uptick in usage in certain drugs because, sure, now there's not that risk involved anymore. So there's millions of people out there, depending on, the world, this particular country, whatever you're talking about, who hadn't tried these things before, even if they had an interest because they were afraid of the possible legal repercussions. So when you lift the possibility of these legal repercussions, more people will be, oh, okay, maybe I'll give this a shot. So for a little bit, there was an uptick. But instead of the dreaded, oh no, now you're just creating junkies all over the place. Funny thing is, that didn't happen. Because you know why? Plenty of those people who finally had the opportunity to try these things tried it and was like, I don't see what all the fuss is about. Or, this was fun, but not really for me. Or, I could see doing this thing occasionally, but not an everyday thing. That's what happened to most people. So yeah, guess what? All the numbers, aside from the criminal stuff, because now people aren't being locked in jail for these things, people are actually getting help for if they have an addiction. And one of the things I found originally about this, and it's always stuck with me, and it actually came up again in an article I think it's in from The Guardian from last year, talking about the fact that this has been such a wide success and why is the rest of the world copying this. But one of the lines from this particular article was something, like I said, I had seen before in looking into the history of the Portugal decriminalization, and the stated policy from the Portugal government regarding drugs in general is pretty powerful as far as I'm concerned. And again, coming from a government, whatever, like no matter who said it, I think this is amazing. And this is what their policy in regards to drugs is, and it rests on 3 pillars. Number 1, that there is no such thing as a soft or hard drug. You know, because some people will call cannabis like a soft drug, and they call, like, you know, cocaine and heroin the harder drugs. Their opinion is that there is no such thing as a soft or hard drug. Only healthy and unhealthy relationships with drugs. Now I'm going to pause for a second because I said there's two more pillars here. But that first pillar, that's beautiful, because that's the truth. There's no hard drugs, soft drugs. You want to call them drugs? Fine. There's these things called drugs. They can enhance your experience. They can alter your mind, whatever. There's no hard, soft. There's no good, bad. It's just the relationship you have with that particular drug. That can end up being good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. Because there are plenty of people who use cocaine regularly, perfectly functionable. A lot you would never even know. One thing I noticed years ago when I started becoming more outspoken about my cannabis use and trying to talk about back in the day legalization, and then I switched to decriminalization once I understood the difference, all these things. I realized as I got older there, and especially in my business too, meeting all these clients over the years, that there are so many people that smoke cannabis or do different drugs that you would never expect until you form a relationship with them and start talking with them, and something comes up and it's like, oh yeah, I do that thing. But you would, from the horror stories you hear, like people getting strung out and they're destroying lives, and yes, that does happen. But there are plenty of people that do these things regularly. I know people that use heroin on a regular basis. No, you would never know, because they're not using needles, so you wouldn't see track marks all over them, but they use it on a regular basis. On the weekends, or a couple times a week, whatever. You would never know. And they're perfectly functional human beings, because they have formed a somewhat healthy relationship where it may not be good for them as far as like the effects of the drugs on their body over long-term use, but they are not letting it impact their lives in a negative way. They're not letting it impact their relationships with other people. They have a somewhat healthy relationship. So like I said, I think that's beautiful. I'm going to read it one more time because I think it's that powerful. There is no such thing as a soft or hard drug. Only healthy and unhealthy relationships with drugs. Bam. Anyway, so that was the first pillar. The second pillar of the Portugal government is, in regards to drugs, is that an individual's unhealthy relationship with drugs often conceals frayed relationships with loved ones, with the world around them, and with themselves. Yes, beautiful. Again, because this is what I was just referring to kind of towards the tail end as I was talking about the last one, the relationship thing. Yeah, a lot of people who have problems who have unhealthy relationship with drugs, where they would have what people would call an addiction. They have, their behavior because of being on the drugs or not being able to get the drugs or whatever it is erratic, possibly violent, all these different things. Yeah. Having this unhealthy relationship, a lot of people, and you find this when you go, as somebody like myself who years ago went through AA and NA. I was kind of forced to at the time, but or not exactly court ordered, but kind of. But and I know plenty of people have gone through it too, and you hear the stories of people and how it either destroyed the relationships they have, or people started in this direction with this self-abusive behavior because their relationships were strained already, or they were having problems connecting with people, or bad things happen and all these, and that's what led them down this path eventually. And of course, every individual is responsible for their own actions, but there can definitely be situations that can trigger these things for people. So yeah, again, I think pillar 2 is another great one, because it's not necessarily the drugs. People want the drugs. People need the drugs. Yes, there are addictive properties in some of these drugs, and people physically feel they need them. But a lot of people turn to these things for the same reason that plenty of people and plenty of people will have no problem admitting this, that when it comes to alcohol, oh sure, alcoholism, and people, they're hiding from their problems, they're hiding from their life, they're hiding from this and hiding from. But when you put that in the same context when it comes to drugs, people think it's a completely different thing. That's just silly. Number one, alcohol, if going by the definition of drugs, alcohol is a drug. It's also a lot more dangerous than most of the other ones out there, but that one's perfectly legal now, thanks to government. They made it illegal and then legal again. Thanks a lot. And that one's promoted all over the place, and that one's actually a lot more dangerous. But anyway, so like I said, it's not necessarily the drugs themselves. A lot of people use them as a cover. A lot of people use it as an escape. I've done it throughout my life at certain points. I've definitely used certain substances as an escape from reality, not just, I want to trip out, man. No, like an escape from my problems, from how I felt, from how I didn't want to deal with things. So that very powerful stuff here. These first 2 pillars, I think, are really important. And the third pillar here, from the Portugal government is in regards to their policy on drugs, is that the eradication of all drugs is an impossible goal. Let me reiterate that. The eradication of all drugs is an impossible goal. Side note, you can substitute pretty much any word for drugs, whether it be guns, or money, for people who think money is the root of all evil, or anything, and have it be, put guns in there. The eradication of all guns is an impossible goal. The eradication of all money is an impossible goal. Prohibition doesn't work, people. It's been proven time and time again. It is an impossible goal to think you can get rid of all these things. Because, as I was describing earlier, look what happens when they tried to ban these substances in the first place, when they tried to make it illegal for people to use cannabis, when they tried to make it illegal for people to use cocaine, when they tried to make it illegal for people to use heroin, or whatever other drugs were out there at the time. All these other new ones started popping up because people said, fine, you're going to make it difficult, you're going to make it dangerous for us to obtain these things? We'll go down to the grocery store. I mean, back in the 70s, that's when they discovered whippets. One of my favorite comedy clips from all time is Dennis Leary when he's talking about drugs. He's talking about whippets. He's like, we discovered that. You're welcome. And back in the 70s, we didn't have this stuff. We were down at the grocery store rubbing hamburger meat on our gums. Like try to figure it out, whatever you could to get high. Because people like that escapism. People like the feeling of these things. And if you tell them they can't have one thing, they're going to try to get that thing. And if they can't get that thing, they're going to go, what can I substitute for that? And that's where all these things come from. So making it more difficult for people to obtain and or use these substances that they're choosing to put in their own body is only going to lead to more problems. And that has been played out time and time and time again. And I mean, the so-called drug war here in the good old USSA has been an absolute nightmare for people. It's been a huge boon for government. I mean, between the revenue generation and the amount of people they've been able to incarcerate, and then of course all the cronyism that flows from that, because as has been noted by plenty of people before, anytime there is talk about decriminalization, and of course it's usually only about cannabis, although I do recall, I think Oregon was talking about decriminalizing the good old magic mushrooms. I think I saw something about that last year. They may have actually gone through with that, I'm not sure. But usually it's just in talks about cannabis. You talk about decriminalizing cocaine and heroin, and even most people who support the legalization or decriminalization, for that matter, of cannabis will lose their minds. Oh my God, you can't have that. One of the running jokes is in the libertarian anarchist circles is, we'd like things to be so freely that there'd be like a heroin vending machine at the local middle school. Kids want to use it, go for it. Kids, just don't hurt anybody. Don't violate the nap. But and of course that's a joke. But it's like I said, people lose their minds when you talk about this type of stuff, the possibility of decriminalizing things. But even when it's just cannabis, when it's talked about, and when some of the states, like I said, Washington State, Colorado, Washington D.C., I think California finally legalized it, or did they finally do medical? I don't even remember what their stupid deal is out there. But whenever these things come up in different states, whenever these bills are brought up and say, oh, let's finally legalize this or finally decriminalize this, or however they're going to put it, usually it's legalization because, well, they want their revenue. The entities that stand up and fight this the hardest are not like organizations like the moms group, like the MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, stuff like that, like any groups related to stuff like that. I mean, sure, they're out there and they're voicing their opinions, but they're not the largest ones, the largest voices. Oh no, by far. The three top lobbying groups to keep things like even just cannabis, keep it criminalized, are almost always the pharmaceutical companies, the alcohol companies, and the prison guard unions. And why is that? Well, the pharmaceutical companies should be pretty obvious to most people. They don't want anybody cutting into their revenue streams. If you decriminalize and or legalize a lot of these drugs, even just cannabis, the amount of people taking the prescription pharmaceuticals drops through the floor. And again, this has been seen all over the place. I mean, there's been studies coming out of Colorado for the past couple of years that, prescription opioid uses, the oxycodone, like all that different stuff that people get hooked on, and not oxycodone. Geez, I'm all right. Oxycontin, all that stuff. People get hooked on. These things are dropping. The number of prescriptions people are requesting. Why? Because they're finding other alternatives to take care of whatever it was these pharmaceuticals were supposed to be helping them with in the first place. And cannabis, CBD oil, things like this have a wide range of benefits. So plenty of people, whether it's for things from depression or anxiety or all this stuff, people are getting off these pharmaceuticals and shifting over to the more natural substance of cannabis. And the pharmaceutical companies freak the fuck out. Of course, oh crap, our bottom line, we need to do something. So they get out there and lobby the hell out of Congress, or whether it's state, federal, whatever it is, in order to try to stop these things. The second one is the alcohol companies. Kind of a similar reason. They don't want competition. You legalize this stuff, plenty of people who come home at the end of the day and have they buy their six pack and they have a couple of beers or whatever, or to the people who go out partying all weekend, those people start shifting to other substances. They don't have as much a need for alcohol anymore. Plus, as has been proven time and time and time again, at least specifically when it comes to cannabis is worlds safer than alcohol, not just on your body, but on the effects that it has on the state that it puts you in. And, drunk driving is a lot more dangerous than stone driving because, well, stone driving, sure. I'm sure there are people could dig up lists of accidents where people have been high, although most of the time when people try to attribute, when the media tries to attribute a death to drugs or a specific drug that they're trying to demonize, this happened the past couple of years with Kratom. They try to weasel that in there and be, oh, this was found in their system. It's like, yeah, they fail to mention the other cocktail of drugs, including prescription pharmaceuticals that were all mixed, and alcohol that were all mixed in together too, that probably had something to do with the crazy state the person was in, because their hormones and everything were so screwed up because they were combining all this shit at the same time. But no, let's focus on the one thing, because that's the thing we're trying to demonize. But so yeah, the alcohol companies, they definitely don't want this type of competition because, well, they're going to see their numbers take a huge hit. And you can see that, you can see in Colorado, you can see people freaking out because isn't Coors still based in Colorado? It's like, oh crap, this is the home of the Rockies and now everybody's smoking weed. Crap, we need to find a new line of work. So yeah, the alcohol companies, they're out there, the manufacturers and producers, they're out there constantly trying to fight these, they're lobbying the heck out of government to try to stop these laws from going through. And the third one, of course, is the prison guard union. And that might be one of the most dangerous ones, because I know a lot of people rant and rave about private prisons and how they're, for profit, blah, blah, blah. again, a story for another time, perhaps. But I mentioned this in a couple episodes back. I think the whole, at the time I couldn't remember the word retribution, but the ideas of restitution versus retribution. People, in a free society, I don't necessarily think there would be jails. But if there were, they would definitely be privatized. So privatization is not necessarily the problem. But the so-called privatized jails we have right now are not really private, because all of these private jails have contracts with the particular states that they're located in that assure them a certain amount of occupancy. And so if there aren't enough people being put in these jails and there's a lot of vacancies, these so-called private prisons can turn around and try to sue the particular state they're in for breach of contract. And they'd be absolutely right. Because unbeknownst to most of the citizenry in these particular states, these contracts were signed where it's like, yep, we're going to set up this prison and it's going to be privately and you don't have to worry about the taxpayer money, blah, 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 blah. But you have to keep 90% occupancy or something insane like that. Which is why there's so many insane laws that are not only still on the books, but continue to be put on the books, whether it's in relation to drugs or other things, because they have to keep these prisons filled in order to keep their end of the contract up. And how else do you do that but other than making a criminal out of everybody? So the prison guard unions, they're really big on trying to keep these things because, what is it? I think it's something like 2.5 million of the people incarcerated in the U.S. are there for nonviolent drug crimes. I think it's something like that. It's the word, whatever it is. I forgot to look that number up before I started. I do apologize, but I believe it's somewhere in that territory. Regardless, it's like, this is, again, widely known. This is not like a hidden statistic. The USSA has the world's largest prison population, despite having, only, 1/10 or 1/12 of the population of the world or something. I don't even remember, maybe even smaller than that. But it's an insane number of people that are locked in jails. And a huge portion of those are for non-violent drug crimes. And I hate using that phraseology because even the so-called violent drug crimes, most of the time, why were they so-called violent? Because the situation was created by government by making these things illegal and making people go out of their way to try to obtain things that they want to freely put in their own body. Or on the other side of that, the people who just want to make a living and want to provide this service for people and don't necessarily want to be violent about it. They just want to, heck, I'd love nothing more than be able to sit out front of my house with a little table and sell, cannabis cookies or stuff like that. But because of the laws, I would have men with guns pointed at me almost immediately if I tried to do something like that, because somebody would call and report me. And so that ratchets up the level of violence and anxiety. So people who would like to engage in those type of services, or provide those type of services rather, often feel a need to protect themselves because, well, the violent gang in blue could come after them at any time, or a rival could come after them at any time. And because of the illegality, it's not like you can, somebody could come to your house, break in, and steal your stash or steal your supply. You can report the break-in. You can report if they stole anything else, but it's not like you can report, hey, man, this guy stole a couple of pounds of marijuana from me. Can you go get it back? Yeah, it doesn't work like that because of the illegality of these things. So it just makes everything more dangerous. So of course, the prison guard unions, like I said, they want to keep these people, they want to keep these things illegal because it keeps their prisons filled. It keeps them making money because they get their kickbacks from the state, and everybody's happy. Well, at least those folks are happy. The overwhelming majority of people aren't happy because the overwhelming majority of people just want to be left the fuck alone. They want to do what they want to do. They want to put in to their body what they want to put into, as long as they're not harming anybody else. That's how most people are. That's the reality. Most people do just want to go along to get along. But that's also why they won't fight back about these horrible injustices, unfortunately. And why, like the headline from this particular Guardian article that I was reading from earlier, states, the headline is, Portugal's radical drugs policy is working. Why hasn't the world copied it? And there's been stories written about this for years now, because like I said, Portugal started this back in 2001. This article was written towards the end of last year in December of 2017. Yet another article. Why aren't people following this? Well, the overwhelming majority of Americans aren't following it because they either A, don't know about it, or two, it's fear. Because the fear that has been drilled into them by, guess who? Government, about how bad drugs are. You know, whether it was that horrible, horrible witch Nancy Reagan and her "just say no to drugs" bullshit, or Nixon and his ratcheting up of the war on drugs, or any of the presidents, politicians, whatever, bureaucrats who have done this shit. They instill fear in people. You know, I mean, going all the way back to Reefer Madness. I mean, that film still gets. You could still find that. You could still find that film, and it's hysterical. But this is what they were actually trying to put out there back in the day to try to convince people of how dangerous cannabis, of all things, cannabis, which to this day there is still not a single reported death from somebody who is using just cannabis, not one, on record. But how dangerous this drug was. And that, you know, propaganda. It's, you know, Edward Bernays is smiling in his grave when stuff like this continues to work. His legacy lives on through this type of bullshit. So, yeah, it's, I mean, what more can I say? The drug war is horrible. To my friend who is upset about, you know, the fact that they're trying to put these safe spaces up. I don't know if you're going to listen to this. Maybe I'll tag you in it and see if you will. But either way, for you or anybody else who thinks like you, like I said, I understand and I empathize with being in, or at least sympathize. I don't know if I can empathize because I haven't actually been through it, but losing people to drugs and alcohol, to drugs like that, to overdoses. I can totally understand your pain and frustration and hurt, you know? So I understand the emotional level, and I understand why you would just assume that people would be, well, as irresponsible maybe as some of the people you know, or be unlucky as some people, because, you know, plenty of people who die of overdoses unfortunately die because their stuff is tainted, and it's tainted because of the drug war. Because if there wasn't a drug war and you could buy heroin at the CVS pharmacy, it would be measured out by a pharmacist. It would be tested to be pure, even if it wasn't sold there. If you drop the drug war and you decriminalize all these drugs, even if you don't make it quote unquote legal, or even if people are unwilling to set up these stores to sell these products other than cannabis, because those pop up all the time when decriminalization or legalization finally happens. But if you're not actually going to have these storefronts for like a cocaine storefront or a heroin storefront or whatever, you could be damn sure there's going to be people who are going to be creating companies that to test the different drugs out there, because they'll make a killing. I mean, heck, back in the day when I was, you know, back when ecstasy was still a huge thing, back in like the late 90s and the early 2000s, I mean, there was people who actually went around and made money by selling these little kits that you could test the potency of your E. You know, they were like $5-10 for these little kits or whatever, but we've, you know, over time, people found out that they were pretty accurate and pretty reliable. And hey man, yeah, I'll pay $5-10. Hey, you want to raise the price 20? Fine, whatever. I want to know the stuff that I'm getting is good. If it's more than a one-time use, even $20 for somebody who's dropping $20 a pill every other day on the, you know, a couple times a weekend, every week. Sure, for $20, I can make sure that the next couple of months of my stuff is all good to go, and I can, you know, if it's not, I can show it to the guy who gave it to me. Hell yeah, man, sign me up. Things like that would pop up all over the place. So you would have drugs that were more safe, not less safe, as the government makes them. So things like ODs on heroin because it was laced with fentanyl would likely be a thing of the past. That's what, Trump's been out there talking about the heroin thing, and plenty of people get up and down about the heroin epidemic, and people freak out about the heroin epidemic. I mean, heck, I even got into it with one of the detectives who was taking my statement during my arrest last year because we got into a conversation about the whole drug thing. And, he was willing to be maybe okay about cannabis, but when it came to heroin, he just kept throwing all these insane statistics at me. And I was just like, yeah, you realize that it's, and he mentioned the fentanyl thing. And I was like, yeah, you realize because it's illegal, right? And he just wouldn't accept that. And plenty of people won't accept that, but it's the truth. If you decriminalize these substances, even if you legalize them, which again, like I said, I'm not a fan of, because legalization means that government still has control over it, and they can also regulate and tax it. And as we've seen in places like Colorado and Washington State, that doesn't go well for the people. You're getting taxed 30, 35, 40% on these things. You're getting ripped off, folks. Especially when it comes to cannabis, stuff that you can grow pretty much anywhere. You could grow it yourself. If it's become legalized or decriminalized where you are, don't go paying the damn fees at the dispensaries. I mean, sure, if you have a friend or you know the person who runs a dispensary, you're trying to help them with their business, that's one thing. But even them, they're getting ripped off too. Just go grow some plants in your backyard and smoke that stuff, man. Come on. Hey. Anyway. So the people that, like I said, the people that think this is, all hell will break loose if these things are legalized, or the people who freak out about the heroin, epidemic and something must be done. Yeah. I agree with you. Something must be done. But it's not more laws. It's not putting more people in cages. It's not doing pretty much any of the things that the U.S. government has done over the past 20, 30, 40, 50, however long you want to look back on this war on drugs. They've done nothing right as far as what could, benefit society as a whole. All they have done is created this culture of fear and a culture of violence. And both of those could be laid at the feet of government, or at least the people who call themselves government. So if you want to fix this problem, so to my friend who is lamenting the idea of these safe spaces, or anybody else out there who thinks like her, and like I said, I understand why you think that way. I'm not putting you down for thinking that way. I'm just hoping you're going to look at this in a slightly different perspective now. Because the answer, like I said, is not more laws. It's not putting more people in jail. It's letting people be more free. It's giving people the opportunity to put things in their body that they want to put in their body. They're voluntarily choose, whatever the reason, even if it is something that they're covering up, whether it's a problem they're not dealing, like they're still choosing. They're an individual. They're still choosing to put that in their own body. If they are not becoming destructive to others after the fact, then leave them the hell alone. And if you do that, and if instead of throwing people in cages for having these substances, for trying to sell these substances, for just, for using these substances, whatever, try to take a page or 20 out of the Portugal book and see how well it's worked. Where instead of punishing people, they're setting up these safe places for people to use the products they choose to use. They're setting up addiction centers where people are voluntarily going and dealing with their problems and then figuring out if they have like other emotional problems beyond that and dealing with that and then walking away from the drugs altogether because it was all voluntary. They weren't forced. It's the same reason that people being forced to detox from certain things. You get thrown into these different rehab setups or whatever, like forcing people out of this stuff. If their mind isn't changed, as soon as they get back out into freedom, they're just going to go do the same things again because they haven't fixed anything else that's going on. Or maybe that same person could go on, figure out all the other stuff that's going on with them, kind of fix that up, and then decide, hey, I still want to use this stuff, but now I don't need it every day. Now it's just straight up going to be a recreational thing. Even if it's heroin, who cares? If they are still a functional member of quote unquote society, if they are not causing harm to any other person or their property, then who the hell cares what they put in their body, when they put it in their own body, and unless it's on your property, where they put it in their own body? Like, seriously, what is it to you? You know, emotions aside, just look at the facts, folks. Prohibition doesn't work. It's never worked. It's never going to work. Because as that third pillar from the Portugal government policy on drugs stated, the eradication of all drugs is an impossible goal. So instead of constantly trying to ban things or prohibit people from doing things, why don't, for once, you take the reins off and see how people do on their own without being micromanaged, without the fear porn? You might be surprised. And I think the people of Portugal can attest to that 17 years later. How amazing things could be, how much better things could be for everybody overall if you just leave people the fuck alone. All right, with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. I'm sure there's plenty of other things I could talk about in relation to the drug war. I'm sure I could go on. You know, there's, like I said, there's a couple of things I brought up that I could probably go into a little further, but I want to keep this one a little bit shorter, so we'll cut it there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Once again, this has been Abolitionist Abstractions. All of my information can be found at solpodcast.org or at steemit.com/abolitionistj, which is my preferred place for people to go because that's usually where most of my content is placed first, including this episode, which will be out, well, tomorrow, but by the time you listen to it, it'll be today. Hey, folks. Anyway, once again, thank you, everybody, for listening, and I will catch you next time. Love, peace, and voluntary interactions for all.
Indians scattered on dawn's highway bleeding. Ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind.
This is Daryl W. Perry, host of Free Talk Live. This November, I'll be running in the world's biggest and most popular marathon, the New York City Marathon, and I've accepted a spot on Team Innocence Project because I'm a passionate supporter of their work. Since 1989, 353 people in the United States have been exonerated by DNA testing, including 38 who pled guilty to crimes they did not commit, and 20 of whom served time on death row. The Innocence Project provided direct representation or critical assistance in 180 of these cases. With your help, the Innocence Project can help even more people who have been wrongly convicted. As part of Team Innocence Project, I am raising awareness about wrongful convictions and raising funds to help free the innocent. I've already paid the race registration fees. However, to secure my spot on Team Innocence Project in the New York City Marathon, I need to raise $3,500 by November 1st. You can support the Innocence Project and help me secure my race entry by going to run.freetalklive.com.